Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're tackling a really fascinating topic. It's consciousness. And to help us unravel this, we're going to be looking at excerpts from Julian Jaynes' book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Prepare yourself, though, because Jaynes puts forward this pretty radical idea. He suggests that human consciousness, the way we experience it, it's a relatively recent development.
Yeah, it's a real mind bender. He's not just talking about sensing the world or even learning. Jaynes is saying consciousness is something else entirely.
So how do we even begin to unpack that? Think about it this way. Have you ever noticed how you can learn things without even realizing it? Say you hear a song while eating something you really enjoy. Later on, you hear that song again. And bam, suddenly you're craving that exact same food.
Oh, yeah. That's associative learning in action. It's happening all the time. And a lot of times, we're not consciously aware of it at all. Jaynes actually argues that consciousness can get in the way of this kind of learning. It's kind of wild. Being conscious of the connection between the song and the food could actually weaken the association.
Wow, that's so counterintuitive. So if consciousness isn't crucial for basic learning, what is it really about? What makes it so special?
Well, Jaynes thinks consciousness is about creating this inner landscape, a space where we can reflect on things, have those internal dialogues with ourselves, and make choices that go beyond just instinct or, following orders from someone else.
So instead of just reacting to the world around us, we step back. We analyze things, look at different perspectives. We even question our own thoughts and motivations.
Exactly. And Jaynes is arguing that this ability, this whole inner world of subjective experience, it wasn't always there. He proposes that way back when, ancient people had a completely different way of experiencing the world. He calls it the bicameral mind.
Okay, now we're getting to the really interesting part. Tell me more about this bicameral mind.
All right, so picture this. A world where people rely on auditory hallucinations, like hearing voices, to guide them and make decisions. And here's the thing. These hallucinations, they weren't seen as strange or anything. People saw them as the voices of gods, ancestors, or authority figures.
So instead of having an internal dialogue, people were hearing commands from outside sources, and they believed these sources were divine.
Exactly. And to support this, Jaynes points to evidence from ancient texts, like the Iliad. He highlights how the characters in the Iliad don't seem to introspect or have inner dialogue. Their actions are often driven by these voices, which they believe are the gods. Take Agamemnon, for instance. He sacrifices his daughter because he's convinced it's what Zeus wants him to do.
That's a pretty drastic example of obedience.
Yeah.
But in a bicameral context, it makes sense. If you genuinely believe you're hearing a god's voice, you're going to follow those instructions no matter how difficult or even horrifying they might seem.
Right. And the language used in the Iliad backs this up. Words that we now use for soul or mind, like psyche, thumos, and phrenon, they had totally different, more concrete meanings back then. For example, psyche often meant life substances like blood or breath.
So instead of thinking about their psyche as this abstract idea of mind or soul, they were literally thinking with their blood and guts.
In a way, yeah. And now this is where it gets even more interesting. Think about those linear B tablets discovered in Mycenae. They paint a picture of a society that's even more hierarchical and structured than the one in the Iliad.
Right. Those tablets, they're all about officials, soldiers, workers, meticulously documented and seemingly ruled by this strict obedience to whoever's in charge. But doesn't this kind of contradict Jaynes' theory? Wouldn't a society that's more organized be less likely to rely on the bicameral mind?
Actually, those tablets could be evidence for an even stronger presence of the bicameral mind. Think about it, the Iliad, with its focus on individual heroes and their struggles. It might reflect a society that's already changing, where the bicameral mind is starting to break down. But the linear B tablets, they offer this glimpse into a possibly earlier stage where obedience to authority was even more ingrained.
So those tablets are like a snapshot of a world where the bicameral mind was running the show, where people were even more likely to follow commands without questioning.
Precisely. Now, Jaynes also draws these fascinating parallels between the fading of the bicameral mind and the decline of auditory hallucinations. Consider schizophrenia, for instance. He describes a patient, Mr. Jason, who felt this undeniable urge to walk into the ocean because of a commanding voice.
That's chilling how closely his experience aligns with Agamemnon's obedience to Zeus. It's almost like they're both responding to this internal command they can't disobey, even if it seems irrational or dangerous.
Exactly. And here's something to consider. Auditory hallucinations. They might be more common than we realize. A study done in England way back in the 19th century found that close to 8% of men and 12% of women reported experiencing hallucinations at some point in their lives.
That's a surprisingly high number. Makes you wonder how many people throughout history have had these experiences and interpreted them as messages from the divine, especially when the bicameral mind was the main way people experienced reality.
It's a really fascinating question. So, to understand how the bicameral mind might have worked, Jaynes dives into the idea of the double brain. You've probably heard of the left brain, right brain split. Well, Jaynes suggests that in bicameral individuals, these two hemispheres, they might have functioned pretty differently.
Are you saying our brains had different jobs back then? Like maybe one side was handling language and the other was creating those voices of the gods?
Exactly. We know that for most people, the left hemisphere is the language center. Jaynes proposes that in bicameral individuals, the right hemisphere might have been the source of those auditory hallucinations. Imagine it like this. The right hemisphere comes up with these divine pronouncements, and the left hemisphere, it just carries out the instructions without question.
That's a pretty incredible image. But is there any actual evidence to support this idea, or is it just speculation?
There is some evidence. Jaynes points to a number of experiments that suggest each hemisphere has different cognitive functions. For example, studies have shown that people tend to judge facial expressions based on what they see in their left visual field, which is processed by the right hemisphere. This hints that the right brain might have a special role in interpreting social cues, maybe even generating those voices that guided social behavior way back in the bicameral era.
So even in our modern conscious brains, there might be these little hints, these echoes of our bicameral past. It's like our brains are carrying around this hidden history, remnants of a totally different way of being. But if this bicameral mind was so widespread, what caused it to break down?
That's what we're going to explore next. Jaynes proposes that a whole bunch of factors, social, cultural, and technological, all came together to create this shift in human consciousness.
Okay, so we've been diving deep into this whole idea of the bicameral mind, where ancient folks relied on those auditory hallucinations like hearing voices perceived as divine for guidance.
Right.
But things started to shift at some point.
Yeah. Around the tail end of the second millennium BC, we see these signs of a big change in human consciousness. And Jaynes points to ancient Greece as holding some clues to figuring out this transition.
Ancient Greece, land of philosophers, democracy,
Ah.
and those delicious gyros. Okay, but seriously, what happened there that was so important for the development of consciousness?
Well, for one thing, we start seeing new ways of thinking and talking about the self. Jaynes highlights the development of what he calls mind-space metaphors. That's where mental states are thought of as having a spatial dimension.
So instead of just feeling things, people started talking about having thoughts in their minds or seeing solutions to problems.
Exactly. It's like the mind transformed into a stage for all these internal dramas. And we can see this reflected in how language evolved. Take the word news, for example. Initially, it referred to concrete things like sights or shows, but gradually it took on a more abstract meaning, became associated with thinking, knowing, understanding.
So it went from like, whoa, check out that amazing news, meaning, wow, look at that spectacle, to something more like, use your news to solve this riddle.
Yeah, precisely. And we see a similar shift with the word psyche, which was originally tied to physical life substances like blood or breath. But gradually, it transformed into the concept of soul or mind.
It's like we're witnessing the invention of the soul right there in the evolution of language.
That's a great way to put it. And this shift towards introspection and that internal dialogue, it's embodied in figures like Solon, the Athenian lawmaker. He really reflected on his own thoughts, engaged in these internal debates, and ultimately made decisions based on his internal sense of justice rather than just blindly following those external commands.
So it's like he becomes the author of his own actions, guided by his own internal compass, not just reacting to external voices or commands.
Precisely. And according to Jaynes, this is a defining feature of subjective consciousness. But even as this new way of thinking emerges, we still see traces of the bicameral mind hanging around in different forms. Think about hypnosis, for example. Jaynes points out how that hypnotic induction, it resembles the narrowing of consciousness that you see in, like, ancient oracles or shamanistic practices.
So instead of a god speaking through an oracle, you have the hypnotist guiding the subject's actions through suggestion. It's like tapping into that older way of experiencing the world, bypassing the conscious mind and getting to a more direct form of control.
Right. And then there's schizophrenia. The hallucinations that people with schizophrenia experience, they might have some similarities with the voices of gods experienced by those bicameral individuals. Of course, schizophrenia is complicated, but this potential connection to the bicameral mind, it really makes you think.
It's almost like schizophrenia could be seen as a resurgence, at least in part, of this older way of experiencing the world, where those lines between self and other, internal and external, become blurred.
That's a really interesting perspective. And we can't forget about religious experiences. Jaynes also brings up glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, as a possible remnant of the bicameral mind. This kind of ecstatic speech, often in religious settings, could be an attempt to connect with something divine, bypassing conscious thought for a deeper, more instinctual way of communicating.
It's like that urge to connect with something bigger than ourselves, something beyond our everyday understanding, is deeply rooted in our history, even in our biology. But as science advanced and we started understanding the world in these more material, mechanistic terms, didn't that challenge the whole bicameral worldview?
Absolutely. The rise of materialism, the emergence of deism with this distant, hands-off God, and of course Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. All of those challenged those traditional beliefs in divine authority and really chipped away at the foundations of the bicameral mind.
It's like science gradually replaced those divine pronouncements with observable laws and replaced faith with reason. But, as we talked about earlier, that need for authorization, it doesn't just vanish, does it? It takes on new forms. So where does that leave us today?
Well, that's what we'll explore in the final part of our dive. We'll be examining what Jaynes' theory means for us in the modern world. And we'll even talk about the future of consciousness itself.
All right, so we've journeyed through this idea of the bicameral mind, ancient people experiencing the world guided by what they saw as divine voices. We've talked about how consciousness, the way we understand it now, how it might have come from this older way of thinking. And we even saw some possible leftovers of this bicameral past still present in today's world. But what does all this mean for us now? What are the implications of Jaynes' theory for how we see ourselves and the world?
One of the coolest things about Jaynes' theory is that it's not just history. It challenges how we think about consciousness itself.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it. We often take consciousness for granted, right? Like it's just part of being human. But Jaynes argues that we're not born with it. It's something we learn, something we develop over time.
So it's not just our brains physically changing, but we had to learn how to be conscious, to have this inner world, all the thoughts and feelings and self-awareness.
Exactly. Almost like consciousness is a skill, like learning to read or ride a bike. And if that's true, then consciousness can keep evolving. We might not be stuck with the same mental model forever.
Whoa, that's a pretty mind-blowing idea.
Yeah.
You're saying we could actually shape the future of consciousness, intentionally guide its evolution. But how? How would we even start doing something like that?
That's where things get even more interesting. Jaynes suggests that metaphor has a big part to play in shaping consciousness. Remember those mind-space metaphors we discussed? People started thinking of their minds as having a spatial dimension. Well, Jaynes argues those weren't just poetic ideas. They were actually helping to build our inner world, our sense of self.
So if we change those metaphors, if we find new ways of talking about and understanding the mind, could we actually change the structure of consciousness? It's like we could rewrite the code of our mental operating system.
It's a bold thought, for sure. And it brings up a lot of questions. What kind of metaphors would lead to a more evolved consciousness? What happens if we start tinkering with the human mind? These are things we need to think about as a society.
It's like we're standing at the edge of something brand new, a frontier of the mind. And Jaynes' theory is a map, a guide to this unknown territory. It's challenging, maybe even a bit unsettling, but it makes us face some fundamental questions about what it means to be human. And what I find fascinating is that Jaynes argues this journey isn't over. We're not just along for the ride. We can actually take part in shaping the future of our own minds.
I think that's one of the most powerful things about Jaynes' work. It's not just about understanding the past, but about envisioning the future. It's about realizing the amazing adaptability of the human mind and the power we have to shape our own destiny, both as individuals and together as a whole.
So, to everyone listening, as we wrap up our deep dive into the origins of consciousness, we leave you with one final thought, something to ponder. If consciousness is something we learn, something that keeps changing, what kind of minds do we want to create? What are the possibilities, the potential problems, and the ethical things we need to consider? We encourage you to explore Jaynes' work further and keep thinking about these questions. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey.